Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab, brought to you by CPA Practice Advisor, with your hosts, Randy Johnston and Brian Tankersley.
Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab. I'm Randy Johnston with co-host Brian Tankersley, and both of us have been concerned about what is going to happen with cybersecurity risk based on AI. And this was probably illustrated even greater recently with the attack by ChatGPT on Hugging Face and the agents having the discussion among themselves. How are we going to do this attack? So it's like, what is going on here? Now, all of these large language models are improving. And of course, regulatory environment here in the US is changing rapidly with the privacy security AI regulation stuff being announced this week, but kept private. So we do not even know all of the details as we're recording this episode for you. But bottom line here is we want you to start being proactive now on protecting your businesses. So, in this case, then I'd like for you to recognize that AI, while being good in many ways, may be bad on cybersecurity. Also, the day we're recording this was the day that Stanford announced that genetic modification and viruses have been created using AI. So it's been one of the concerns I've had for a long time, but that was officially announced in news articles earlier today. So notice there's lots of what I'd call the bad part of AI coming along. And so, Brian, I'm going to turn it to you for just a minute to just kind of get your setup and thoughts on this as well.
Randy, I have to say that this, since Mythos came out, since they announced we had issues with it back in April, I've been very concerned about this. And the more research and the more reading I do, it seems like, just like we had with where coding has changed forever around the end of the year when Claude Code became really kind of the dominant way that software got developed. I think that security is going through a similar transition right now. And the real concern about this is not about Mythos specifically, but really about what's going to happen when the open source models catch up with what's happened with the proprietary frontier models. Okay. So again, we've seen, I will tell you that I was absolutely shocked when you and I did our tech call for CP America and was preparing for it. And I noticed that Microsoft had patched in, I guess it was May or June, patched like 570 vulnerabilities that were ranked, recognized vulnerabilities, CVEs, as well as about a half dozen 0 days. And so it's one of those things where the volume of things that are being discovered by AI and the speed at which it's happening means that we're at I think, a fundamental shift in how security has to work. And we really have to get away from the traditional definitions-based antiviruses and other tools to really proactive tools that are looking at, again, all the data out there. So the landscape has really changed.
It has changed in a huge way. Now, Brian, this week, I actually was looking at an AI governance tool to control tokens and access and so forth. It's a very fascinating tool. I know you were teaching, so you didn't have the chance to participate in the demo, but I am very concerned about the security of data from one AI platform to another, the securities of the model context protocols, the MCPs, and for that matter, vendors hoovering up and using client data, which could be a CPA licensure problem. But, it seems like a lot of professionals are looking the other way on that. But, what I expect to have happen is a lot of the security tools that we've used traditionally will have more and more AI in them trying to take defensive positions for us. But, it is clear that the numbers have already been shifting. The time to first attack after a vulnerability is exposed is well below an hour now. And it used to be measured in days, weeks, and months. further, I think from our research, we've concluded that somewhere between 80 and 90% of the attacks were executed by AI, not by people. So, and I also believe in the AICPA town hall, they quoted a statistic, which I do not have the backing for. It's just what they said in the town hall, that cybercrime is the third largest business in the world today. So, if those numbers are really true, oh my. And, high value organizations are often targeted. Maybe that's ability to pay. We've said before, follow the money. But, humans are still among our weakest point on this with phishing and so forth. And, I am getting numerous phishing attempts every day. I think my favorite one this week was the lawsuit filed against the company email. And, it looked very valid, but, looking at it, it's like, yeah, this is not a real deal. We would have been served and, blah. And we have no threat of being served that I'm aware of. Okay, there might be, but, I can see that if you were anxious or stressed or tired, you might just click through and you're compromised on that.
Yeah, I will say it's been very interesting because I have cpate.ch as a domain registered. And one of the things about having that is that because I'm on the domain contact for it, I'm starting to get more and more spam in German in addition to English. So, it actually went through my spam filter in pretty good detail for a session that I did yesterday as we're recording this. And it was amazing to me the extent to which we were being targeted. And of course, the reason we're being targeted is because of this client confidentiality issues. We have pretty much the dream identity theft set of data. And, again, in many cases, we're also fiduciaries that are in charge of the disbursement of funds and have the controls over those. And so these firms are really they're really the place where all of the different systems that are out there that are used to manage and control funds and to control organizations really fit together in those ERPs.
So you don't sprechen die Deutsch? I don't quite understand that, Brian.
No,
But
what are you going to do?
oddly enough, another one of our associates and I were speaking yesterday, Stephen Yoss, and he mentioned how many of the spam emails for him were addressed to Steve. And he doesn't go by Steve, right? But he's getting emails addressed to Steve, and right away he knows those have to be somewhat bogus. And so
Mm-hmm.
you can teach your people for these types of tricks. But of course, many of you are running client accounting services functions, or you have ACH information on your tax returns. So you've got wire authority and payment approvals, which again are very feature rich. And in an additional accounting technology lab, we've talked to you about updating your required written information security policy, discussing a few of these same concepts. But realistically, the credentials, the firm logins are keys to dozens of your client systems. And in many cases, you may even have credentials that are not for your systems, but for clients' bank accounts, let's say, or other things like that. So, because of retention policies, many of our businesses have documents on file for extended periods of time, and that also creates additional liability.
Yeah, and I will say that again. I want to kind of walk us through one of the initial AI run campaigns in here. So this actually happened in last November. The state linked group, agentic coding tool, turned it into an attack engine. They targeted technology, finance, chemicals, and government. Had a small number of intrusions that were successful. Once they got in, they mapped the network, found sensitive systems, identified tested weaknesses, wrote exploits in code, harvested and validated credentials, moved laterally, and again, pulled the data out. And again, I think one of the things that's important to understand here is that when you're using AI, you can process all of this in parallel, where, when humans are doing this, they have to process this almost in a linear fashion. So they have to go from this to that to the other. And then when they're iterating on things, you can't, you can't iterate on the other things right now because you have to really focus on doing the task at hand. And so, on the other hand, with this, they could go out and again, the AI had perfect recall of the exploits that they had found that worked, and so it could try the ones that worked first, and many other things like this. Um,
So,
so
Brian, you're talking about this. In the past, we have talked about these attacks of bad actors. A classic one in this case was the Florida water supply. But, as we're recording this session today, the water treatment facilities have been attacked, we believe, by Russians at this point, and that has now spread into 12 different states. And I don't.
and we're seeing significant Iran involvement in that too, because of the current Iranian conflict that's going on as we record this in early August.
Yeah. And so notice where it originally was in Minnesota, Minnesota reports over 30 municipal water facilities that have been attacked, but now it's in a dozen states. So I don't even have a good number on that type of thing. But, I'm also quite cognizant as we're speaking, that there's water shortages in Puerto Rico where people are having to hand carry water as we're talking about this. So just consider yourself for a minute. Electricity is valuable, but if you don't have any water, tell me how long you're going to hang around, right?
Yes, sub 1 week. Yeah, it's
Pretty ugly. So anyway, but I don't want to sound too over the top on this type of attack, but I do understand just how much of our infrastructure is at risk on this. And, the attackers are using these tools that they can use alternate attack methodologies very quickly. And so, fact of the matter is, we are trying to have you think about how you stand up your defenses and how the attackers are trying to defeat your defenses or guardrails.
Yeah, and so again, the attackers jailbreaked the model. They posed as a firm running defensive test, and so then they went through and sliced things into innocent looking steps, and then it invented credentials and stolen data that was public. So again, lots of it. So it hallucinated too. So that's all actually happening. But then we got to this spring, and Anthropic's Mythos came out. And again, when this came out, I think it's important to note that there was a row that happened between the U.S. federal government, specifically the Department of Defense, and Anthropic about how the DoD was using Claude, and it got pretty ugly pretty quick. The president himself even got involved in it, and I think that looking at that now in retrospect, 3 months later, it strikes me that maybe that row had a lot more to do with use of Mythos as a hacking tool against other nation states. And so this preview was one of the largest cyber capability jumps ever happened, multi-step offensive tasks in here, higher risk cyber requests that were again they were running through here. We had access runs going through the vendor so that abuse could be detected, planned, and reporting. And again, Mythos preview went under Project Glasswing so that they could come out with patches, and boy, the patches have been forthcoming. I've noticed that we've literally patched thousands of, not thousands of different CVE in the last 4 months or so as a result of this AI detection and this AI hacking. And so I want you to understand that this capability right now is just in the frontier models. But everybody, all the experts we read about are saying that those capabilities are going to be in the open source models, which the government can't regulate, by the way, within months. And so we're living truly in interesting times.
Yeah. And Brian, as you look at this again, think about Mythos, think about Fable, think about the current chat GPT 5.6 model and so forth. All of these tools are so much more sophisticated than they were 6 months ago. And, the case study that you just used was November of last year. So that was, clear back in like chat GPT 5.3 or 5.4. You just look at how much more sophisticated these models are today. So, unfortunately, you know, I don't believe that governmental regulation is really going to fix this. And, in a prior podcast, we had discussed the four leaders all trying to come up with regulatory models. And, obviously the Google's DeepMind CEO left the week that we're recording this podcast as well for, different pastures, if you will. But this is not a solved problem. It is way early in flight.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you've got to understand is that I think the cybersecurity environment for CPAs is going to get extra ugly this tax season, because now we're going to have, I think, by the middle of tax season, I think we're going to have open weight models that are unregulatable that will be used heavily for cybersecurity. And unfortunately, we have a lot of CPAs that choose to live with out-of-date technology. They have already flawed home grade routers in their offices. They use unsupported operating systems without security updates. They have unsupported hardware. They have things that are past end of life. And so they have significant technology technical debt, because they need to replace all this stuff. And unfortunately, it's kind of a perfect storm because of the AI bubble that we're in right now. The price of things, as we've talked about in a previous episode, the price of RAM, the price of new hardware, the price of just about everything has gone crazy. Ubiquity, that's one of the infrastructure tools that I use, like Cisco or others. Ubiquity actually now has a surcharge for RAM, because RAM has gotten so expensive. So where it's, up more than 400% since last year. So as we're thinking about this now, we're really entering a scary place. And so, if you haven't already done it, you really need to step up your cybersecurity posture now, because we're going into a very bad neighborhood with very scary things going on. And again, if you're not really buttoned down, I think bad things are going to be able to happen to you in this next year or so.
Yeah. And Brian, even though you've talked about the cost of all the hardware going up, the cost of the tokens are cratering very quickly, including open source models and Chinese models. So, talk about, again, perfect storm. We have this situation where the attacker's tools are actually dropping in cost very rapidly. So, oh my.
Yeah. And again, the thing about this is that, there are people, just like we had with BitTorrent and with some of the peer-to-peer things 25 years ago with music, there's nobody to subpoena. There's no central person in charge of these open source tools. And once somebody posts something on Reddit, even if it's just out there for a few minutes for the weightings and the configurations and everything, sure, you can shut it down on GitHub or Reddit. And then as soon as you do that, somebody's going to post it somewhere else on Yandex or someplace where they can't shut it down. And so I want you to understand that when these things are out, they're out, and there's no real coming back. So again, in 2025, the open model trailed the closed frontier by 6 to 10 months. By mid 2026, the gap's 4 to 7 months. GPT 5.2 matched a frontier model. GLM 5.2 matched a frontier model 4 months older. DeepSeek matched a 5-month-old thing. But again, as we're looking at this, if this happened, because Mythos hit in April of this year, the first of the year is really going to be that 8-month mark where we think things are going to get crazy. And unfortunately, your firms aren't going to be in a position to do anything, to do significant things, because you're going to be so busy making hay trying to take care of all your clients during that time of period where you don't have time to sell. Okay.
As we talked about in the WISP podcast, think about how you're going to respond if you're attacked, an incident response plan. And just note that we think the coming few months could be the time frame it happens in. I'm going to go a little bit further, Brian. We did not talk about that in advance, but it's my opinion we may see a few of these attempts made during tax extension season this year, kind of quietly testing the tools. much
Yeah.
like we are seeing some quiet testing of tools in the election seasons right now.
Yeah. And I wouldn't put it past a lot of foreign actors and domestic actors too to do all kinds of crazy things around the election.
Yeah, well,
Um,
we've had the social media election and now we're going to have the AI election.
yeah, it's pretty nuts here. So just kind of looking at this now, we have, again, just to kind of look at things, we got a list of things that are overhyped in the left here. And again, we do want humans still in the loop. And there are a lot of vendor claims in here. What's real, though, is that we have, again, like Randy mentioned, we have cheaper attacks, we have more targets, we have the machine speed, shrinking the response time, same tool, no breaks. And again, there's no dispute. Okay, everybody agrees that this is happening. Everybody agrees that this went on. I mean, according to some of the reports I read, of course, the government's not going to comment on the record about this, but according to some of the reports I've read, Mythos actually defeated not only every browser and literally had hundreds of vulnerabilities in JavaScript and other web languages. It also defeated all the secure systems of the National Security Agency, which is one of the most secure button-down environments in the world. So, for it to defeat all of those systems is pretty epic.
Yeah, and the models are still hallucinating, but one thing we don't want you to think, it's not Terminator and Skynet at this point. I'll be back. But, bottom line here is it is much more risky than you might see. A lot of us go along content in our own little world and we don't think about it until it affects us. And I don't know which one of you might be the us.
Yeah, the hard part about security, of course, is that there's really a really bad feedback loop. Many times you don't even know that something bad's happened. So, we've listed out a few things here to do, harden and rehearse things. You're going to want to if you're watching, you're going to see higher attack levels and a higher attack pace. I will tell you that I have, besides my environment where I've got my router that's connected to two different internet connections, I've also got some public servers that I have root access to, and I monitor those. And I will say that the attack volume is going up significantly, and there are a lot of things happening. So you're going to need to, you're going to want to rehearse your incident response in here. And again, to also shorten your detection to containment times now. So get better at fixing problems because it's very likely that you're going to have those coming up.
And you may need to do a restore from backup. So as fundamental as that is, get the fundamentals right, including testing the backups. And beyond that, you want to make sure you're looking at all your own AI. In other podcasts, we have talked to you about a three-tier model, the productivity, the AI built in, and the agents and MCPs that are getting built. But I want you to take the time to inventory all the tools in your stack. Consider which data is actually leaving your firm and how, and check the audit trails now so you can also see what they look like when they've been compromised and make sure that you control your data. Many of the vendors are trying to lock up your data, but you've got to be taking the actions now because when security's working, you don't really notice that it's working. That's another one of the problems with security. It's when security fails that you now know that you've got a problem. So it's one of those things that's very hard to spend money on and feel good about it because it's like, yeah, I throw this money, but I can't see it's doing anything for me. Yeah, there is a bit of a FUD factor on some of this, but if you're waiting for things to be certain, that ain't going to happen. It is just you are likely to be one of the ones that are attacked along the way here. So,
And, again, the thing here as we're looking at this is that we're not trying to be, I know we've covered a number of difficult topics in the last month or so. We had our session on GLBA and WISPs and other things like that. And now we're talking about this. And we really hope that we're wrong about this concern on security. Okay. But all the other people that I talk to and then I read that are commenting and everything, I think everybody's kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Okay. Because we've seen what's happened. We've seen the effect that could be generated with Mythos and other things like this. And it's some of these problems look pretty scary. So it's our job to tell you what's going on. And sometimes we're giving you bad news, and I'm sorry.
Yeah. In fact, as you were saying that, a friend and associate, Dave Bergstein, has many times walked up and says, Rena, I love listening to you, but you're always negative. And I usually say, look, it's my job to tell you the good and the bad. And in this particular case, yes, Brian is absolutely right. There's some stuff that I would consider negative here, but he knows me well enough. I'm an upbeat guy. I always maybe a little too Pollyanna-ish on a lot of this. So just understand that Pollyanna Randy is suggesting that you may well have some really ugly conditions in front of you, and I'm trying to keep you out of the storm. So
Yeah.
that said, a delight to be with you again in today's Accounting Technology Lab, and we look forward to having you listen in again in the near future.
Good day.
Thank you for sharing your time with us. We'll be back next Saturday with a new episode of the Technology Lab from CPA Practice Advisor. Have a great week.